Alright folks, well in this video we're going to talk about the new versions of Camera Raw inside of Photoshop CS3 and also inside of Lightroom. Mainly we're going to concentrate on the basic area. What I want to show you here is what's new, and I want to show you that what you have inside of Camera Raw inside of Photoshop CS3 Beta is the same thing, and I'll jump over to it, as what you have inside of the basic area inside of Photoshop Lightroom. So whichever way you go with it, you'll know the same settings exist in both places, and you can leverage what you know and what you learned from this video about what's new either way on either one that you use. So let's start off inside of Camera Raw. First off, we're in the basic panel, and up top nothing has changed. You have your white balance, you have your temperature and tint. Other than now you have some colors behind here so you can see if I want to cool it, move it toward blue. If I want to warm it, move it toward yellow. So, but nothing has really changed when it comes to this area up top. Now, at the bottom here, a few things have changed. First off, we have exposure. And exposure is going to be an overall brightening of the photo. So if you look over here, as I drag my exposure to the right, you'll see that histogram starts to climb over on the right-hand side. And I'll be pushing all of my information, all of the white areas in the photo, I'll be pushing them toward white, making them white, and hence clipping them, making it so there's no information in there. If I turn on my highlight warning, you can see that I've got some highlight clipping here where there's white, there's nothing there. So I would normally pull my exposure back to the point where I don't see so much of that. I don't want to pull it back all the way because then it gets a little too dark, so I can leave a little bit. And then here is where the new recovery slider comes in, and this is what we didn't have before. So you can see I've got my highlight warnings on, and see the highlight clipping areas here. As I drag my recovery slider to the right, watch them disappear. So what I'm doing here is I am recovering the highlights. It's almost like the shadow highlight tool in Photoshop, the adjustment. I'm recovering those highlights to make it so they're not all white anymore. And here's the thing, let me turn the highlight clipping off. You'll barely notice a change in the photo. Nothing else in the photo gets affected by this, only those extreme bright areas that were under the highlights. So that's where this guy comes in really handy, because now instead of pulling back on my exposure, I can do it here because I'm happy with the way my exposure was. Alright, let's turn that off. Now we've got our fill light. Fill light is an overall brightening of the photo, and where I used to use the brightness slider for this, now I tend to use the fill light. Here's how it works. Take a look at, again, the right area of the histogram. Remember before when I moved my exposure slider, well, everything over there started to climb and it started pushing everything toward white. Fill light is different, where it's going to work more in the mid-gray areas of the photo here. So as I drag this to the right, watch what happens. Take a look at the histogram, and you see this mid area, see this right over here, you can see how it starts to just move toward the right and become brighter. So if you need some overall brightening, that's the slider I would use now. I don't use the brightness slider anymore, and that's what the brightness slider used to do. You can see it, but the brightness starts to push things toward clipping as well. So that's why I pull back on that one. Alright, now we'll move on to the blacks. Blacks is kind of like almost the black point slider inside of levels. So if I were to open this photo in Photoshop and I were to look at my histogram, I'd have this dead area right over here in the histogram. And if it were in levels, I'd take that black slider and I'd move it over here to this point, to where the histogram started to climb, to add some contrast to the photo. Well, here I shot this on a black Westcott background, and that black background right now is looking very gray, probably because of the lighting that I had set up. So what I can do here is take my black slider and watch this part of the histogram, okay? Take my black slider and I'll move it to the right, and you see what it's doing? See how it's pulling that part of the histogram over to the left. Alright, so it's the same thing as had I gone into levels and started moving my black point slider to the right. I've done the same thing, and now look at my background. Now it's black. It's not that dark gray color. And then finally, brightness. I said that I use fill light for now. Contrast, I typically will now come over to the tone curve and add just a little bit of an S curve here. We'll take a look at that inside of Lightroom, but again, it works the same here inside of Photoshop as well. And now, vibrance and saturation. Let's go over to Lightroom for this. They're the same thing. I'll show you what the new vibrance slider does. So inside here, Lightroom, we've got the same controls we had in Photoshop. White balance, temperature, tint. Exposure, recovery, fill light. Alright, so bump up my exposure, makes everything brighter. Alright, you can see I have my highlight clipping on. I can take my recovery slider and I can start reeling that back in, and you don't even see a change in the photo when I do it. I mean, that's before, that's after. It barely changes, and it brings back the detail that I had lost inside that white flower. Same thing with fill light and blacks here. They work exactly the same. Brightness, contrast. Remember I mentioned in contrast, I don't really use it here anymore. I would come down to the tone curve, and I would apply myself just maybe a medium contrast tone curve to it. It's a little bit of an S curve here. But now we get down to vibrance and saturation. Before, we only had the saturation slider. So I would take the saturation, I'd boost it up, but I'd get a lot of hot colors inside the photo, especially with portraits, because it would start to really make the color of the skin too hot. You can see I'm going to bump this up to 50, way too far, but see what it does to the color of the skin, as well as everything else here. It's giving an overall saturation boost to everything inside the photo. So, let's bring this guy back down to 0. And vibrance, the way vibrance works is it gives you a color boost, but only in the areas of the photo that have less color saturation. Alright, so watch the stem, watch the background. We'll bump this up. I'll take it all the way up to 50. I normally wouldn't go that far, but here we're back up to 50, and the photo doesn't look as bad as it did when I gave it that saturation boost. It's still a little bit too hot, but it's not quite as bad as it was before. So here's the other thing. Watch this. Watch the skin color. Watch when I move saturation. See the skin? Okay? So watch when I move vibrance. My skin color is, for the most part, staying the way it should. And I wouldn't normally go up to 60 or 70 here. So take a look at my skin color. I've given some good saturation boost to the stem and to the background. But see, my skin color remains the same. So that's what I found about vibrance. If you're working with portraits, you'll find that it'll keep your skin tones intact. Okay, you won't be making the skin too hot and too saturated. And that's why I really like the vibrance sliders. It seems to leave the skin tone alone, but give me a good color boost inside the areas of the photo that need it. So pretty much right now, I don't really use the saturation slider much anymore. And folks, that's pretty much it. You can see it's between Lightroom and Photoshop. These two basic areas are the same. So when you know one, you automatically know the other one. It's really up to you which one you want to use. Right now, I'm using Lightroom for everything. I'm importing into the library module. I'm doing all my sorting, everything inside the library module, and then I go over to Develop, and that's where I do all of my color and my tonal corrections, just because I find it easier than going between Bridge and Camera Raw. I just find Lightroom kind of consolidates everything for me. At that point, I move into Photoshop. That's where I do my pixel pushing, if you will, any edits that need a little bit more work than others that I could do here in Lightroom. And Lightroom and Photoshop are very good right now about working with each other. So when I take the photo into Photoshop, I can bring it back over into Lightroom, and Lightroom will remember that I had a raw photo, and now I've also got a Photoshopped photo as well. Now, we're not going to leave you on your own to learn all this. If you're a NAP member and you haven't heard yet, there's a new magazine called Darkroom Magazine. It's the how-to for Lightroom. And as a NAP member, you're watching this video, that means you'll be getting it for free. So it should be starting in the next couple of months after Lightroom is released, but you will indeed get it for free, and we'll talk more about all the cool things that you can do here inside of Lightroom as well. So, whole point here though, this basic area, whether it's Photoshop, whether it's Lightroom, it doesn't matter. These new controls that you have in here work inside of both of them, and just by knowing one, that means you automatically know how to use the other one.